From KUER News in Salt Lake City, this is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. For young people, making your way through adolescence is often about trying to be distinctive in a subculture that demands a kind of social and fashion conformity. In her teen years, Malia Johnson knew she had one thing that stood out: her name. Malia is a name created by her mother. And like the scores of other Utahns who invent names for the kids, Malia's mother had a purpose. She believed the name was pretty, and she wanted her daughter to grow and give the name meaning. Malia is proud of her name.
It's something that is your own, Dad. No one else can take from you. You know, it's yours. It's nobody else's.
Today on the program, we're exploring Utah names. There are the older varieties, the Printhas, the Valois, the DeVerls, and the modern versions. What is it about this place, this culture, that has given people the license to create their own names? Utah baby names today, after this. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. The people who settled this place came here to start their lives from scratch. They knew they would stand out from the rest of the world for what they believed and how they lived, and they came to expect the gawking from observers. Over time, they became proud of their distinction, pleased to be peculiar people. Perhaps it is because of this that Utahns began creating their own names. Today in the program, we're exploring the unique phenomenon of Utah names, and we're hoping you'll give us a hand. Call us with a question or a comment, or tell us the names you've heard or created. Our number is 585-WEST. That's 585-9378. Or you can send us an email. Our address is radiowest@kuer.org. First today, this. No one really knows when it started happening, or why for sure. But at some point, all the bland Scandinavian and English names, the Johns, the Peters, and the Williams, became the DeVerls and the Valois and the LaVaughns. Now, crack open today's newspaper. Go to the obituaries or the birth announcements, either one. Oh, sure, you can spot the usuals, the Jessicas and the Michaels, but only in Utah, it seems, will you see such an array of original or, well, different names. From Arvid to Zalor, Adonia to Zebulun, Utahns have a knack for crafting their own names. There aren't any rules to this. When you're creating a name, vowel and consonant placement doesn't matter. Apostrophes can replace entire syllables. Surnames can become first names. You can stretch the question of gender. And you may even stumble upon a name that sounds remarkably like a body function or a feminine hygiene product. In the business of Utah names, anything goes.
Here's the A's. You can see Adalini, Adelian, Adalata.
From the kitchen of his apartment in East Salt Lake City, Warren Ostreicher reads from his collection. Names gathered from 25 years of living in Utah, alphabetized and neatly tucked into a brown binder. Growing up in Brooklyn, he says he thought he had heard all of the name possibilities, but nothing prepared him for what he found in Utah.
And when we came out here, the shock of the difference in the names, the name mix is so different out here, that I said, I have to do something about this.
Ostreicher began a collection. Most he found in newspapers, but floating around in his brown binder are napkins, receipts, tea bag packets with names like Clyda and Midia and Friel scrawled on them. After identifying hundreds of Utah names, Warren Ostreicher still doesn't know why Utahns create them. But he does have a theory.
I think personally, although I haven't investigated it, is that they feel that when they get to heaven, they don't want to be mistaken for somebody else. They want to earn their own kudos, their own tithing money has to pay for their own niche up there.
Ostreicher's hypothesis is really as good as anyone else's. The experts are the people who have spent hours compiling and sharing them.
I thought, well, what really makes these Utah names? How are we able to recognize them? And so we began writing down all the Mormon names that we knew.
People like Carrie Clark, who, along with her husband Wesley, collect names from their home in Springfield, Virginia. The Clarks weren't born or raised in Utah, but they are Mormon and did live here for a time. They first began their collection after hearing the name O'Donna on a television commercial in Virginia. She's got to be from Utah, they thought, and they were right. The Clarks have even set up a website called the Utah Baby Namer, and they've received thousands of responses. Carrie Clark says that a Utah name is hard to define, but you know it when you hear it.
The quintessential Utah name often has a French-sounding prefix, such as da, la, na, or va.
While many Utah names seem to have little rhyme or reason, surprisingly, many do follow certain characteristics. Carrie Clark says it seems Utahns take names very seriously.
I think that it is a desire to make the name unique, saddled with the very ordinary surname. And there are a lot of kids in Utah. It's a very young population. That is part of the motivation, too, is to create something unique that just belongs to you.
It was this desire for distinction that brought Sherry Johnson of West Bountiful to the name game. In the calm before her children return from soccer practice and school, Johnson finds the time to talk about the names that she has created.
Okay, Larissa, Talina, Brianna, Anissa, Mariah, Kirsha, Malia, Patria, Sonoma, and Joshua. 10. Mm-hmm.
10 Johnson children in all, and most of their names are creations or variations. There are disadvantages to these unique names, Sherry Johnson says, but the ones she can think of are harmless things like not finding personalized keychains and plastic rulers. For Johnson, the advantages far outweigh the inconvenience or confusion. The names she has invented symbolize family or beauty, and to her they have great meaning.
A name just has a feeling to it. I want them to be able to create their own identity with their names.
Johnson has found that while people try to use names to impose a character or a status on a child, it is usually the children that give the name the definition, not the other way around.
At first it's just a word, and to me they're pretty words, or I wouldn't have used them, but I think the meaning has come from what they are.
In fairness, Sherry Johnson and her husband did try an escape route. They planned nicknames if their children didn't like them or were teased too much, but frankly the names aren't any less unique or conspicuous than their given names. None of their children have resisted their names, at least not to Sherry Johnson, but she doesn't quite know what to make of the fact that all of her grandchildren have very normal names, like Matthew and Ryan and Alexander. Johnson's 16-year-old Malia, a mixture of two family names, doesn't seem bothered by her name. In fact, at a time in her life where the actions and the words of her peers are so often carbon copies, she knows that she has one blaring detail that is different, and she likes it that way.
I like it because people remember. They're like, go to me, oh yeah, I know you had a really different name, you know. So they remember me because of that reason. It's something that is your own, that no one else can take from you. You know, it's yours. It's nobody else's.
Carrie Clark and others say you're taking a risk when you create a name. Just ask the poor little girl who grew up Bidet. But why not? A Utah name tells so many people so many things about you. And when you do slip the confines of Utah obscurity and attain greatness far away, those of us back here will read about you. And just by knowing your name, we'll be able to say, she's one of ours. Today in the program, we're exploring Utah names. Again, our number to join the conversation, 585-WEST. That's 585-9378. Or our email address is radiowest@kuer.org. Joining us today to help us talk about Utah names from her home in Virginia, it's Carrie Clark, who we just heard from just a moment ago. Carrie Clark, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Happy birthday, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Also with us in studio, two professors from Brigham Young University. Professor Dallin D. Oakes, a professor of linguistics at Brigham Young University, is with us. Professor, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Also with us is Professor Bill Eggington, an associate professor of linguistics at BYU. Professor, welcome to you. Thank you.
It's good to be here.
Let me start with you, Carrie Clark, first, if we could. When did you begin this fascination with Utah names?
Well, in the mid-'70s, when I was a freshman at BYU, under Professor Oakes' father as the president of the school, I had never been exposed to a population like that. I was raised in Southern California. I was a convert to the Mormon Church. And my roommate's name was Aline, which I'd never heard before. Mm-hmm. She had a friend, Malou, M''Lu, which, you know, prompted me to say, do people ask you to skip to it all the time? but you know, so I noted it then, but it really, I didn't really become fascinated with it until years later when my husband and I moved to the East Coast, when, being totally out of that environment, it became more glaringly obvious. You sort of take it for granted when you live there. Yeah. You hear a lot of people with those names. Lavelle Edwards was the football coach at BYU. And you notice, you don't really notice it because it's around you. But when you're taken out of that environment and you hear an unusual name like that, then suddenly it becomes a talisman to that experience, and you notice them.
Professor Oakes and Professor Eggington, I wanted to get your perspective. When was it that you gentlemen started first taking note of Utah names or of Mormon names? Professor Oakes, you first.
Well, I'm interested in it maybe in part because my own name is kind of an unusual one. I of course, received it from my parents. My father received that from, he was named by his parents. His name was kind of an interesting one. It's a surname, but my grandmother had attended an unveiling of a sculpture by the famous artist Cyrus E. Dallin.
Wow.
She was so impressed with the artwork, and she was pregnant at the time and decided that if that child in her womb was a boy, when he was born, she was going to name him Dallin, after the surname of the famous artist Cyrus E. Dallin.
That's a great story. Professor Eggington.
I think I became interested in it. Well, first of all, it's a field of linguistics. It's got a fancy name called onomastics, and I'm a sociolinguist, so I became interested in it as a sociolinguistic phenomenon. Why they do that here in Utah or in the sort of Mormon-influenced area of the Rocky Mountain West, and just sort of grew into that interest. Professor Oakes and I are putting together a book that's a very academic book that's going to look at the phenomenon, and it's a collection of different articles that are examining the whole naming phenomena, including place names, first names, second names, and then also sort of the relationship between names and our religion.
We should mention, again, you can join the conversation, 585-WEST, 585-9378, as we explore Utah names. Let's go right to the phones. Doug is on a cell phone. Doug, you're calling from Washington, D.C.?
Actually, I'm from Sandy now, but I'm originally from Northern Virginia.
Yes. Welcome.
Thank you. I used to be a practice law in Washington, D.C., and I would tutor in the inner city, and I tutored 3 girls named Tarkita, Talika, and Tanika, 2 of them with apostrophes in the middle. I was going to ask our guests if there are any commonalities, common threads that they can draw between the culture here and, say, the African-American culture in, say, Washington, D.C.
Professors, any of you?
Well, this is a question that I think perhaps we should direct to Cleveland Evans, who will be here later in the hour.
Yes,
but he has done some research and, in fact, has observed some similarities between names given by African Americans and names given by Mormons. And I kind of don't want to steal his thunder, but I think he's observed some interesting things.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and we will get to that somewhere near the bottom of the hour, Doug, so thanks for the call. 585-9378 is the number, 585-9378. Carrie Clark, I want to ask you, you've created a website. Do you get a lot of hits?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, my husband says that we're among the top 10% of websites. I mean, well, that's there's billions of them, but still, with the number of hits that we get quite a few. And we usually get a bounce whenever there's an article about the website.
So, I mean, the idea is more than just collecting names. I suppose people are looking for a place to share the names they find.
Yes. Yeah. Well, some people. I've actually had a couple of people ask to have their names removed, which I don't always honor because I figure, it's public domain. Okay.
Sure.
Your name's out there. But we don't mean to demean anyone or to criticize. We just mean to point out this phenomenon in the culture. And we first set up the website in 1996 when I wrote the article that accompanies it, and it was rejected by a magazine in Utah. So my husband was kind of playing around with the internet, and he said, let's put it up as a website. We'd already started collecting names, just talking to our friends, and so now we've got about 5,000 names on it now. It's far weighted in the girls. There are far more girls than boys with unusual names.
Huh. Gentlemen, let me ask you this. Do you find the same thing? Are there far more women's names than men's names?
Yeah, I think generally parents are more creative than the women's names than the male names. What we've found is a lot of the male names are really closer just to mainstream America. This is current. A lot of the data that I've collected, for example, goes from 1970 to the present time. And I think in your front piece you mentioned that there was that one lady, I think, who said that her grandchildren are now being named just regular U.S. names.
Right.
And I think that's what's occurring, and especially amongst the males. It's almost parallel to Social Security number indexes that you can get off the web where they list the first names. And what's occurring in Utah is the same as elsewhere across the U.S. now. That's not to say it wasn't quite fashionable, a long time ago.
Sure. Let's take another call. Janice joins us on the line. She's on a cell phone. Hi, Janice.
Hi. I have two names. One is a female name from my neighbor. She gave her daughter her middle name, Joy, and the first half of her husband's name was Dale, and so the daughter's name is Joy Dell.
Joy Dell.
And then the other one is my grandfather's name. His mother had a few boys and then had her first daughter, gave her her first name, and that daughter passed away. She had a few more boys, had a second daughter, gave her her middle name, and that daughter passed away. Had a few more boys, and was bound and determined to have a child named after her. And so when she got to her last pregnancy, she said, I don't care what the sex of this child is, they are going to have my name, at which point it was a boy. So she took her last name, which was Slade, took the D-E off at the end, put it in on the front to create Desla.
To create what?
D-E-S-L-A.
Say that again. Desla?
Desla. And at the time, it was in early Utah, and there were lots of Deserettes. And so my grandfather often got mistaken for a girl because they thought it was so similar to Deseret.
Tesla. Terrific.
And when he eventually grew up, he went and had his name changed to put the Slade as his middle name, and he went by Des
Slade.
Mm-hmm.
That's good, too. Janice, thanks.
You're welcome.
585-WEST, 585-9378. Today in the program, we're exploring the unique phenomenon of Utah names, and we're hoping you'll give us a hand. Call us with a question or a comment, or tell us the names you've heard or created. We're going to take a brief break right now. We'll be back in just a moment. This is Radio West on FM 90. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Today in the program, we hope you'll join the conversation. We're exploring Utah names, trying to figure out how it is and when it may have been that Utahns first became bold enough to create their own names. You can call us at 585-WEST, that's 585-9378, or send us an email. Our address, radiowest@kuer.org. Maurice is in Provo. Maurice, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks. I live in Provo, but I'm not originally from Utah. I'm from Arizona, and I'm of Native American descent. And I'd be interested to see if there was any studies on maybe if, these people that are name experts went to the reservations and things, because on my reservation, I've heard some pretty interesting names. The Ina ending, or Een, seems to be really popular among girls. My aunt's name is Ruthina, met Philomena's, and my aunt and uncle, David and Ruthina, have a daughter, and they combined their names to make Daveline. And I have there's another lady that works in the tribe that my parents are friends with, and I don't know where this name came from, but her name is Lamomi.
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 Wow.
Yeah. But, there's all kinds of funny names on the reservations. I think that if there's people interested in names, they ought to go to, look among Native Americans as well, because they come up with some pretty good names.
Maurice, thanks. 585-WEST is the number. With us in the studio, Professor Dallin D. Oaks. He's a professor of linguistics at Brigham Young University. Bill Eggington is also with us, an associate professor of linguistics at the Brigham Young University. And gentlemen, anything to say about Maurice's comment? What about Native American distinction?
Could I first correct one thing?
Please, what did I say?
We've got it just reversed here. I'm the associate professor,
I see. Okay.
and Dr. Eggington is
Dr.
the
Eggington,
professor.
You were quite big, not to mention that before. Okay.
Thank you for that correction.
Sure.
That just shows that I'm older. What I think is going on with the Native American thing, and also as someone mentioned before, and we said we'd talk about it when Cleveland Evans came on the show. But minority groups that want to distinguish themselves from another, from the mainstream community, tend to be more creative in producing their own names, and they follow certain patterns. And what happened here in Utah, and what happens in a lot of African American communities and in Native American communities, is people do the blending. You know, they get a part of one name and part of another name, and get very creative and put them together. Or they do the prefixing, you know, where you get the prefix, the La prefix, and pretty soon you've got LaVaughn and so on. And it's quite an exciting tradition, and one that I think should continue and be something that's done in mainstream America.
Could I just add one other thing? Linguistics is a science. It's what we sometimes refer to as a soft science, and so we're very interested in finding empirical support for some of the impressions that we get about language and how it works. And so that's why when you talk to Cleveland Evans, you'll see that he's done some number crunching and surveying, as well as Dr. Eggington in their own work in looking at, you know, okay, we've had the impression, we know different people who do these kinds of patterns. How does that relate to an overall percentage of people who name their children? And so we are very interested in quantifying and seeing if these correspond to actual trends that can be verified and documented empirically.
Well, let's actually introduce Dr. Cleveland Kent Evans, who joins us now on the line from his office in Nebraska. He's professor of psychology at Bellevue University in Bellevue, Nebraska. Doctor, are you with us?
Yes, sir.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
I wanted to ask you, are you able to detect any kinds of trends these days, as just, I guess, national trends, before we sort of speak about the particularness of Utah? Are you noticing any trends in the way people are naming their kids these days?
Oh, well, the biggest national trend is simply that the percentage of children who get the most popular names is going way down. And in fact, just in the last 15 years, it's fallen rather amazingly. It used to be about 40 years ago, you'd get almost 5% of the boys were given the most popular boy's name in the country, and now it's definitely below 2%. And if you look at either the top 10 or the top 50, you get the same trend, is that people are much more varied in what they're naming their kids. And I'm not sure that that's really a change in people's values so much as a change in the information that's available. There are so many places on the internet now where you can find a listing of what the most popular names are, and there's so many people for years who have said, I don't want to give my child one of the top 10 names. Well, until about 15 years ago, it was hard to know what the top 10 names were, but now you can go find it easily on the internet, and so people can avoid them empirically.
We keep talking about how unique we think we are here in Utah. You clearly, Utahns, I guess Mormons in particular, have a knack for creating names, but you've done some examinations of names, for example, say in Nebraska. Are Nebraskans creative as well?
Sometimes, and I don't think it's Nebraskans per se, but I think that there are, ethnic differences, social class differences in what people think are appropriate names, and that sometimes that gets wrapped up with some subcultural differences, as in Utah. And when I, have done my comparisons, and, I wrote a paper where I compared names in Utah with those in Colorado, because it's the state that borders Utah that has the least percentage of Mormons.
Right, right.
And there are a few ways in which Utah is really very distinctive from Colorado, but perhaps not as many as people might think. I think people remember all the differences and forget all the big, similarities that there are. The huge majority of people in Utah have names which would fit perfectly into Denver, and vice versa.
I want to get Carrie Clark back into the conversation. Carrie's joining us, by the way, from her home in Virginia. Carrie, are you? I guess you're as much an expert as any of us. You've been observing this. Are you detecting trends?
Well, in fact, Dr. Evans asked me a few months ago about the current trend in Utah of naming kids boys Ammon. I guess isn't that right, Dr. Evans? Ammon has become a popular name suddenly in Utah, but that is culled from the Book of Mormon,
sure.
And those are names that I don't count. I am looking for the created names that people come up with, often like Troyleen and Joydell, those names that the woman mentioned earlier. That's what I look for. But I would, there are certainly the vast majority of people have ordinary names. But it seems to me that, and two, I believe that Dr. Evans said several years ago when we first communicated with each other that he noticed that Utah was often on the leading edge of names that then spread throughout the country. For example, Hunter. A lot of people named their boys Hunter because there was a Hunter who was the president of the LDS Church. But about the same time, there was that model, Hunter Tylo or something like that. I'm sorry if I've gotten her name wrong. But and so that kind of, but that was a girl's name. So names like Tanner and Hunter and Spencer and Kimball have spread through the country, but a lot of them are inspired by what I call soap opera-esque names that on soap operas you would hear, and that way names spread through that are unusual but still, like Spencer, mainstream.
The kind of Alexis
and it
kind
is
of name.
true that a lot of those soap opera-esque names are like surname transfers.
Right.
Their last names turned into first names.
Right.
And I think among the popular names, there does tend to be a little bit of a trend, especially looking at Colorado and Utah, for Utah to pick up on those surname transfers, which are going to be popular a little quicker, although sometimes it works the opposite with other things. I mean, I think a good example is two names that in 98, which is the last year I have the whole Utah data, were in the top 11 for girls in both Utah and Colorado, which are Hannah and Haley, but two start with H. Mm-hmm. And you go back and look 8 years previous in 1990, and Haley was already in the top 30 names for girls in Utah, where it's not on Colorado's list at all in 1990, but it's the reverse for Hannah. Hannah is already popular in Colorado when it hadn't been picked up in Utah yet. So the surname transfer, which of course is going to sound more unusual to people because it hasn't been a girl's name before, hits more popularity in Utah, but the sort of revival of the old-fashioned name Hannah hits popularity in Colorado earlier. So.
I want to read a few emails that we're getting. RadioWest@kuer.org is our address. Tom sends this one. He writes, one of my favorite Utah names belongs to the daughter of Myron and our Lieutenant Governor Olene Walker, Mylene. And in fact, I wanted to ask Doctors Bill Eggington and Professor Dallin Deoaks, who are with us here, this idea of compounding names, this is really typical of Utah names. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, people take a piece of one name and a piece of another name and join them together and come up with these unique creations. And it's quite exciting to watch. And quite often now, a lot of those names, the compound names, are moving into becoming second names as a means of sort of hanging on to the heritage. This phenomenon, by the way, is not unique to English. Lots of other languages in their naming practices take a piece of the heritage from both sides of the family line and connect them up into these long multisyllabic names. So it's an interesting trend that occurs.
Another email comes from Cheryl, who writes, my family has a few names to add to the list. Some of my nephews, Heber, Logan, and Ammon, as we heard before. And then this from Arl. My own name is Arl, pronounced like Carl with no C. Although I wasn't from Utah, I did grow up in a Mormon family in Alaska. I came by my name honestly, though. I was named after my grandfather, who was in turn named after the French town of Arles by his nursemaid, who was from there. Arl, thanks very much. And I want to finally, before we go into a break, we have with us also the incredibly gifted cartoonist for the Salt Lake Tribune, Pat Bagley. Pat is no more of an expert on Utah names than you or I, but he does qualify as an observer and an expert in that sense. Pat was gracious enough to donate some sketches for our baby name book, Raising LaVaughn. And Pat, thank you for joining us. Thanks for the artwork, by the way.
Well, thank you. The book, I'm just looking at the proofs here, and they look great.
Yeah, they do. So talk a little bit about, just briefly before we go into a break, the sketches themselves. I mean, I suppose you have to, do you think of LaVaughn or LaVaughn when you are sketching out some of the, characteristic Utahns that you try to sketch in your cartoons?
I guess I think of Utah activities, what kind of things we like to do. And so the kids, in a lot of instances, are doing those things. Or in another way of looking at it, is what we'd like them to do or grow up to be. Hunter, I guess, comes from the last name of an LDS prophet. But, there are a lot of hunters in the state, and I'm sure that it got in there that way, too.
Yeah. Pat Bagley's with us. I also wanted to mention Carrie Clark is with us. She's joining us from her home in Virginia. Dr. Cleveland Kent Evans is with us from his office in Nebraska. And Professor Dallin D. Oaks at Brigham Young University. Professor Bill Eggington is also with us. You can join the conversation 585-WEST, 585-9378, or our email address, radiowest@kuer.org. We need to take another break. We'll be back in just a moment. This is Radio West on FM 90. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Today on the program, an answer to the question, what's in a name? If you live in Utah, it's a different matter entirely. Utahns seem to have some kind of knack for creating different names. You can join us with a question, a comment, or a name. Our number, 585-WEST. That's 585-9378. Or send us an email. Our address is radiowest@kuer.org. Let's go right to the phones. Ann is joining us on a cell phone. Ann, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I'm really enjoying this program today. I have a sister-in-law who is LDS, does not live in Utah, and has named her son Garen. And she did not like the fact that the only place we could find it on the Internet was on Carrie's website.
Carrie, are you still with us?
Yes, I am. She despises Utah with every bone in her body. So,
but she's still been influenced by the culture, whether she
likes it or not. And thanks very much.
Thank you.
585-9378. This email comes from Wes Clark. Ask Carrie how difficult it is to get by with a Utah baby named Kari that gets turned into Carl, and she's forever correcting people. I'm sure this happens to others.
That's my husband.
Yes.
My name is spelled C-A-R-I, and I have a very unusual French maiden name. And my mother's thought was that she was going to simplify my first name. Well, in that simplification, and I know she's listening now, she lives in Sandy. Apologies to you, Mom, but she inadvertently made it even worse, because people would say Kari or Carl, mistaking the I for an L. Half of my credit cards have Carl on them. And there was one time, even in a class when I was in college, I did not recognize my name from what the professor read because he garbled it so much. So the thing is, the amount of time that you have to spend explaining, spelling, pronouncing is, I think, frustrating. Some people, obviously, it doesn't bother. I've had emails from people who love having unique names and say, all my brothers and sisters have unique names. We think it's really a lot of fun. And that's great, but parents really have to take that into consideration. I mean, I think of the man-hours that you spend throughout your life messing with your name. It can be frustrating.
Speaking of unique names, Cliffany joins us now. She's on a cell phone. Cliffany, welcome.
Hello.
How are you?
Fine, thanks.
Spell the name.
Cliphane.
And how did you come about the name Cliffany?
Well, it's interesting. A family that my mother knew had a babysitter, and one of the young children couldn't say the name. She called her Cliffany, and they just figured out how to spell it and named their next baby girl that, and I was named after her.
And are you proud of it, or does it bother you at all?
Oh, it's been fun. Everybody calls me Cliff.
You prefer Cliff?
No, not necessarily. As a tomboy growing up, it was a lot of fun.
We're glad you joined us. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you.
585-9378. This comes from Sarah. She says, it is not only the folks in Utah that have sought different names for their children. In the 1960s and 70s, young people in the hippie or alternative culture gave their children quite a few names that were creative. In the 1970s, I lived in an isolated, primarily Hispanic community in southern Colorado and encountered a number of unusual names that I had never heard of. Perhaps this is a question that could go to Dr. Cleveland Kent Evans, who joins us from his office in Bellevue. I guess, do various generations have different names as well? Different ways of making names, I guess?
Oh, well, of course, different... the culture keeps changing, and what's considered appropriate at one point in history is not at another, and then some of that is just from the sound fashion. I think when I was first listening to this, Dr. Eggington was talking about the law prefix and how that was very popular in the African American community, but that was at its peak, in the 80s, and now law in the African American community is getting to be a bit passé, and they prefer things like Shah and Tay and Tai and things like that to start the names with. So, fashions keep changing, and so what people come up with keeps changing from generation to generation.
This email comes from Don, who writes, I've noticed that one of the most popular distinctive boys' names in Utah right now is Dallin, inspired by LDS Apostle Dallin H. Oaks, the father of one of your guests. And Don asks, what is Professor Oaks' thoughts about this trend? And you may defer to your colleague, I guess, on that.
Yeah, that the name has definitely increased in popularity. When I grew up as a kid, I always looked in stores where they have the license plate things for bicycles. I'd see the Tom and
right.
and Harold and Bill and everything, and I'd always look for my name. It was never there.
That's great.
But the name has increased. Dr. Eggington has seen some of that in his research.
Well, I'm actually holding, this is something that Dr. Eggington brought, which is a graph of the frequency of the name Dallin by year. Talk about that, Dr. Eggington.
Well, yeah, it first appears sort of way back in 1970. There are two examples in birth records here in Utah.
Is that you? No, you're before that.
I'm before 1970.
Yeah, okay, got it.
I should say this research is verified by Dr. Evans as well in his own research.
Yeah, he's done parallel research that just matches this. It first starts to take off in about 1985. You have about 60, 1992, 102, and then by 1999, 162. And so the graph is an upward trend, and it will be interesting to see if Dallin makes it over to mainstream America. You never know. It could.
That's what I wonder. I mean, I guess, does this happen? Carrie Clark, are you seeing any unique names making any sort of a jump, or do these remain pretty distinctive, pretty unique?
Well, I really can't say. We take submissions from people who read our site, and with some desultory research, in other words, I try to verify that these people were somehow influenced by the culture in Utah or the LDS culture. For example, the guy who was of the American Indian descent and talked about that, I'd love to know if those people to whom he was referring with those names were actually members of the LDS Church or not. So I really can't say. I think that, though, there is a distinction between the African-American names and the Utah names, in that the Utah names seem to have genesis in mixing, the compound names, whereas the African-American names seem to be made up out of whole cloth, with the Shah and the Qua and the things like that in it. And I think, too, that when you get a celebrity with an unusual name, you get permutations of that name or that name more, that becomes mainstream.
Dr. Evans, is that what you found?
Yeah, well, certainly if, again, you have somebody who's popular and well-known, that presents the name to the community. And then if it fits in by sound with the other trends that are popular at the moment, then it can sometimes, be picked up and hit very quickly. And I think Dallin is really interesting in that because it is one of the few names that is popular in Utah, which still at this point is basically unique, to Utah and to LDS culture. But I think, and I don't know if you've already talked about this, but Professor Oakes shared with me that the way his father got that name was that his mother named him after a sculptor in Utah who was famous at that time named Cyrus Dallin.
Yeah.
But, she turned the last name into the first name. And I really think if she had named him Cyrus, he wouldn't have as many namesakes because Cyrus doesn't fit in with what's popular. Dallin sounds enough like Alan and Brandon and Darren and all the other things that are generally popular across the country that a lot of parents can hear it and say, oh, that would be a good name, for my baby, where I don't think Cyrus would have been.
Back to the phones. And Ogden, Jerry joins us on the line from Ogden. Hi, Jerry.
Good morning.
Thanks for waiting.
My aunt, Ida Marriott Kyle, born in Ogden, Utah, 1912, named her only daughter just the way Professor Oakes mentioned a while ago. She wanted her daughter to have her two grandmothers' names and her aunt's names, and the grandmothers were Mary, Lena, and her aunt was Madeline, so it became Mariline, Marileine.
We'll add it to the list. Jerry, thanks.
Thank you.
Daniel's on a cell phone. Daniel, welcome to the program.
Hi, how you doing?
Good, thanks.
Hey, I know when we were looking at children's names for our three children, we did all the typical research and stuff about, frequency of names and things like that. So we wanted to, I've got a very common last name. So we wanted some way to distinguish our children from the rest of them out there.
Right.
Unfortunately, we weren't so successful with our first child. We named him Austin.
Yeah.
Quite a few kids got that name. In fact, there's 5 of them living in my complex that have it right now.
Well, name at least one more of the others. What did you come up with?
We come up with Ian for the second one.
All right.
And we named the third one Kyla.
Kyla. Well, now Ian's traditional, but Kyla, is that new? Anyone know?
That's I got it from an album called Quest of the Dream Warrior.
That's great. Daniel, thanks, and we were glad you called.
All right.
Time for one more call from Heber. Bridget's on the line. Hi, Bridget.
Hi, thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
On program, and I'm thinking about where these names come from, and the Utah names, they're not, I shouldn't say not allowed, but they're not reaching back into, let's say, old world or saints' names. And therefore, they have to reach into the Latter-day Saints' names.
Right.
That's my theory, where,
it's probably
where are the Elizabeths, the Bridgets, we have to go to New York for that.
Any of the experts here? It seems like as good a theory as any. Bill Eggington?
I think a lot of when you look at the top 10 list of Utah names, they're close to American names, but they also contain for male names a lot of biblical names. One name has come up to the top here in Utah is Emma, and maybe because based on sort of the more recognition of Emma Smith. Although Emma, as I look at the data in other states, Emma is elsewhere as well. So it's hard to distinguish what's particular to Utah.
A character on Dynasty or something. Maybe that has something to do with it, Kerry Clark.
If you want the particular to Utah popular one, you should mention Caden, Caden, Braden, and Jaden right now for boys are the ones which are really popular in Utah, which are not nearly as popular anyplace else, especially Caden,
Pat and Will, Pat Bagley, these are fairly common names. Did you have any distinction in your family as to Utah names?
No, my full name is Patrick Francis Bagley. So I think my parents wanted a cardinal. It's kind of hard when you're growing up LDS.
Pat Bagley.
But Will, I should mention, I grew up calling him Bill Bagley.
Yeah.
But the association with hobbits was a little too close. And so he's called himself Will ever since.
Pat Bagley, of course, with us. He is the cartoonist for the Salt Lake Tribune who did the artwork for our book, Raising LaVaughn. And, Pat, I just wanted to thank you again for generously donating your work.
It was a pleasure.
That. A couple of quick emails, just briefly. In the late 1980s, I was working in a dental clinic in San Francisco. My patient's name was listed as Nilva. I went to the waiting room thinking I'd find a woman, but it was in fact a 10-year-old boy. I commented that his name was uncommon. He said he was named after his father. I replied, so your dad's name is Nilva? He responded, no, his name is Alvin, which is Nilva backward. Of course. And one more finally, how about Ray Don and, of course, the classic, must have been a classic, Utana. Thanks very much to all of our guests. Kerry Clark, who joins us from her home in Virginia. Kerry, mention the website, would you?
You just go into a search engine and type Utah Baby Namer, and it'll come up. It's in Yahoo GeoCities.
Happy birthday again.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, Pat Bagley. Thank you. Dr. Cleveland Kent Evans, an Associate Professor of Psychology at Bellevue University in Bellevue, Nebraska. Thank you so much for the time.
You're welcome.
And Professor Dallin D. Oakes, Associate Professor of Linguistics at Brigham Young University. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And adding your name to the discussion, Professor Bill Eggington, Associate Professor of Linguistics at BYU. Thank you very much. And thank all of you who joined us for the program today. Radio West is a production of KUER News. Our engineer is Louis Downey. Our operations director, Larry Holt. Technical direction today from Mike Anderson. The program is directed by Tiffany Casey. Station manager John Green. Our news director, Jenny Brundine. The program is produced by Ann Milliken. I'm Doug Fabrizio.